I've been asked here today to talk to you about legacy industries and how they're dealing with digital transformation. You can tell I'm from a legacy industry because I'm wearing a tie. Is this working? Yes. I'll try to explain during this why I actually do that. You may not think that the organization that I represent is really a legacy industry. I work in the media. What can be more hip and fashionable than working in the modern media? It's appropriate that we're here in a coffee shop environment today because that's where in the late 17th century the original hipsters launched Lloyd's List. Now, Edward Lloyd was an early media entrepreneur who started Lloyd's List simply by tacking a list of ships coming in and out of the port of London to the wall of his coffee shop. And thus was the internet born. Almost. Now, the establishment was a popular place for ship owners, for merchants, for traders, seafarers, and Lloyd catered to them with reliable shipping news. And the shipping community would go to the coffee shop to discuss maritime issues, to discuss insurance, shipbroking, trade. By the mid-18th century, after a few changes of ownership, Lloyd's List settled down into a newspaper. An early version. Mind you, we'd done 560 issues by 1740, so admittedly the layout's changed a little bit since then. And that's how things would have continued had it not been for a fresh set of hipsters in another coffee shop that emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They liked the idea of the coffee shop, but printing was no longer fashionable. Black Friday, 20th of December 2013, the final edition. What could be more galling to an old school newsman than to announce your capitulation with a hashtag? So that's the Lloyd's List story and how digital disruption has affected one industry. So what about shipping, the industry it covers? This is something of a hidden industry. It's seldom fashionable, seldom talked about. A life at sea in times gone past was something you had to be encouraged into. Shipping is responsible for the carriage of 90% of the world's physical goods. You may think that an industry that is so critical to the world's trading infrastructure might be at the cutting edge of technology, but you would be wrong. Shipping has, for thousands of years of its existence, been focused on one asset and one asset only, and that's the ship. How do you bring innovation to an industry that does not want to change? It can be offered, but this is a conservative industry, and not one that necessarily wants to be changed. Alternatively, it can be forced upon it. Now, the best way to do that is with a good recession that puts the survival of these companies at risk. This was the disruption that the container shipping sector faced, and it was here that finally digital technology started to get a foothold as companies attempted to find a way of becoming profitable again. Unlike publishing, shipping may not quite yet have found its own modern coffee shop, but I would think that it's at least starting to show the signs that it's on its way.
Very interesting. I've got a few notes I think I'm going to challenge you on, but I think before we do that, if we could invite up John Lee from TMX Group as well. And John, perhaps I could ask, first of all, for you to give a quick introduction as to who you are and what you do, after which maybe we can get into a bit of a discussion based on James's presentation.
I didn't realize you were going to talk about ties, but I actually don't have one on, so sorry about that. My name's John Lee. I'm the Vice President, Head of Innovation and Enterprise Delivery at TMX Group. For those of you that may be out of town and are not quite sure what TMX Group is, TMX Group is actually a collection of organizations dealing with capital markets. So we have several stock exchanges, the major Canadian ones, the Toronto Stock Exchange, Venture Exchange. We also have the Montreal Exchange, the Natural Gas Exchange, as well as our clearinghouses, so CDS and CDCC, and the National Depository. So that's why we call it TMX Group. It's basically one unit that was formed as a result of the Maple transaction that took place in 2012.
Excellent. Welcome, John. So I guess what we want to do here is have a little bit of a discussion based on the presentation. I think, as we mentioned from the start, the objective here is really to understand other industries. What can we learn from that relative, I guess, specifically to banking, financial services here? Are there specific lessons that we can take from the shipping industry and apply to financial services? And for either of you here.
The challenges that you guys are having are so similar to the struggles that we as an organization have as well. Not just the exchange, but also the industry as a whole. If you draw the parallels and you think about where shipping was and where containers was, think of the stock exchange. You know, the TMX is 160 years old. It's actually older than Canada. And if you think about the transformation that we've done, there really are only a couple of major, I'll call them breakthroughs. And you know, for those of you that have watched any type of a movie, there used to be a trading floor. A bunch of crazy guys with funky jackets, all waving hands, paper flying all over the place. And if you think about that, sure, there are still some pockets of that exist in the world today, mainly in the future space. But if you think about the equities markets, they've matured significantly. They are not paper-driven anymore. They're all electronic. That was a major transformation. We did that in the better part of the 90s to try and figure out what is the standards on how you can actually go and communicate with each other. That last trade that took place, you know, was almost 20 years ago if you think about it. And it's crazy when you think about how you move from a paper-based manual way of actually facilitating a transaction to where it is today. And I firmly believe with a lot of these technologies that are coming, we are on the cusp of yet another massive transformation similar to that. And so when I look at some of the big recession hits in the container business, you think about where we are as a market as well. And you know, sure, recessions aren't necessarily good for the exchange business, but you know, our volumes have been stagnant for the last few years. If you think about companies that are trying to raise capital, it's been steadily declining for the last few years. And it's not that the innovation movement isn't happening, it actually is. Yeah. It's just not happening in the traditional sense. And so you can start to see a fundamental shift.
I think one of the lessons that's come to me from this is that, you know, you mentioned the slowdown in your own industry. That leads to moves to cut costs, and this is where innovation is usually driven from, this idea that, you know, if we get rid of open outcry trading, then we can get rid of all these expensive, you know, floor bidders.
Yeah.
You know, we had that happen in the UK markets and with the Big Bang in the 1980s when the whole banking and stock market sector was changed. In shipping, it's been this idea of, you know, if we can get rid of having people filling in forms, the number of telephone calls that are still made to get a transaction done to find out, you know, where a container is and whether it's been offloaded yet and so on. A lot of this stuff, in theory, the technology there is there to automate these processes and make these things happen. But I think my point is that until you can get over that cultural challenge, then it makes it harder for those cost savings to.
I totally agree with you on the cultural challenge one, because if you think about how you can actually go and innovate. You can't really go and innovate by yourself. You can't just go and say, I'm going to go and innovate for the industry and everyone's just going to do it. And it just doesn't work that way. Yeah. It's really trying to figure out how you can work in a different way, an alternative way. But not only be able to do that, but you need to share that knowledge and get the buy-in from the industry to actually go and mobilize. And that's a big challenge. That's not something that you can do overnight.
And one thing, the shipping industry, you know, we had Tim Berners-Lee this morning talking about the W3C consortium. So we don't have that. We have a bunch of individual companies all trying to do their own thing, do it better. I mean, there have been some instances. There's an organization called Intro, which is a sort of a joint booking system for containers, which was put together by a group of container container lines. But you know, we have CMA CGM doing its own incubator, but that's to develop technology for itself. And I can guarantee that Maersk is busy doing its own thing as well. So having this sort of critical meeting point where that can become an industry-wide standard is a really important thing. And I'm not sure how easy that is in a diversified market like this?
Well, I mean, let me jump in there, and I should say, by the way, from EY are actually publicly working with Maersk and Microsoft in relation to a blockchain merger
Well, they
solution.
they did their famous trial this
But
year.
let me just challenge us all a little bit, and I think let me challenge Innotribe a little bit as well. In that I'm kind of despite having fintech in my title, I'm inherently skeptical of this idea of innovation. I mean, how do we innovate? How do we drive innovation? What does it all mean? I mean, ultimately, you innovate, if that's even a thing. Ultimately, what you want to do is improve the fundamentals of your business, improve your competitive position, or make more money or reduce costs. I think innovation as an objective, I think, is a little too fluffy. But are there fundamental threats to the industry that could drive fundamental change?
There's always a perceived threat that Amazon is going to start, either buying its own ships or finding some way of taking over the industry. There's a big sort of background fear there. Fortunately, it costs an awful lot of money to start up a shipping company. It's not something you can. There are fairly high barriers to entry. But there's this perceived fear. Nobody knows what it'll be yet, but everyone's still waiting for the kid in the basement to come up with some, true innovation, something that changes the model of how the business is done. It hasn't happened yet. We haven't had the Uber moment in shipping yet.
I mean, I think you could, in the capital market space as well, I mean, I think perhaps it's nearer term that we can think about genuine threats to the basic fundamental business model of
the improvements through cost-cutting, digitalization to save costs, improve your business technologies. All right, is that innovation? Probably not. Bitcoin comes along. That's an innovation.
That's a driver, yeah.
That is something that can unsettle your entire business.
So actually, to answer the question, what has spurred the attention of this particular audience in this industry is really that competitive threat. It was, even if I look at Sybos a year ago, what the hell was blockchain? What is that? What does that mean for me? Is this something that's actually going to disintermediate me or not? I need to learn more.
I guess what we tried to do is bring some pretty divergent industries, one of which is fully digitalized in effect, and one of which, can it be digitalized?
Well, no, you can't digitalize a ship.
Unless people are
product that has to be.
Unless people are manufacturing locally. I mean, perhaps in a medium-term view, we talk about 3D printing. We talk.
Nearshoring has become a big. These are the innovations that are becoming threats. 3D printing, maybe that's going to take off. Who knows? I think it will become a lot more relevant. If you can print your own pair of trainers in Toronto, you don't need to ship them from a factory in China. The other thing that's becoming more interesting that's come up recently is the whole idea of robotics. And apparently, most of the robotics that are being sold at the moment are being sold into low wage economies like Southeast Asia. That's the biggest market for robotics. Now, if they're finding it cheaper to buy a robot than to pay somebody a few farthings a day to make sports shoes, then if it's viable for them, then why is it not viable to start buying them in Canada and making those products here? So when that happens, again, you no longer need these big trade lanes of.
And equally, I think we'll see. We're already seeing political pressures in that regard. I mean, I think one thing perhaps that does have a commonality across all these industries is, actually the impact of regulatory and policy decisions. We've already heard some of the big U.S. tech firms make noises about, manufacturing in the U.S. and so on because of the kind of political landscape and so on. That, of course, would have an impact for shipping, equally financial services.
Probably one of the most heavily regulated industries around.
Well, everyone in financial services likes to say that because they want to avoid more regulation.
Trust me, I've got 13 regulators that I have to report to every 3 months. So it's definitely there, and I think. To your question around innovation, it really is changing the way we think, changing the way we operate. And everyone always focuses on the technology itself, but I completely agree. That's probably the easiest part. It's actually the leader. It's actually the enabler. The real challenge is how do you get the regulatory environment to actually go and figure out how to adopt this and bring it into the incumbent space. And I think, the legacy organizations that have been regulated for a long time actually do have the upper advantage on that side of the fence, on that side of the debate, and it's really for theirs to lose, right? And if it's something that they choose to ignore, then eventually they, a lot of these other organizations that are competing for your business will crack that, and once they get there, the status quo will quickly erode.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I mean, the technology point, I mean, if you come to this conference 20 years ago, I would have been giving the speech about how, electronic data interchange and client-server computing were the big new things.
The big thing, yeah.
Now we're talking about blockchain and the cloud. The technology's changed. The issues are still exactly the same in terms of getting those technologies adopted and making them relevant for the
It really
business.
is the enabler. If you think about, how much advancement has come in terms of just raw computing power and just how cheap that is.
Yeah.
It just, everyone in this room has a phone. That phone is 20 times more powerful than any computer that's been around 15 years ago. And if you think about that, that computer costs a fortune.
Yeah.
Barring the Apple iPhone cost, which I think is crazy. But, think about what's in your hand right now.
Yeah.
And you just realize, wow, how on earth did that happen?
Yeah.
And even if you go back 10, 15 years,
Yeah.
no one would have thought that a phone that was traditionally used for just having an actual communication is now your lifeline for pretty much
But I
everything.
still think the point is it's until you find a way of fitting that into the business processes, no matter how much computing power, because 15
No,
years
absolutely
ago,
right.
the
You
power
need to find
was
that business, the business use case that actually can harness this
Yeah.
and actually move forward. Because if you don't, it's just basically technology looking for a problem.